A brand that receives a lot of attention, and also a lot of criticism, is either well-founded. Nomos is a brand that has established a strong footing in the industry, but are their watches actually any good from a design point of view? Let's have that discussion. As always, if you would like a watch topic of yours discussed by a designer, comment them below and I'll write them up. To understand Nomos, you don't need to understand watches, and you don't need to understand the watch industry or the hierarchy of things. To begin, you need to understand the foundations of Bauhaus. But yes, you've heard this word being thrown around by people before. Bauhaus design, Bauhaus simplicity, Bauhaus watches. The word is used so flippantly by so many, but the truth is, quite frankly, they don't know the repercussions of the word at all. Off the bat, if it wasn't for the Bauhaus movement, my field of industrial design wouldn't exist. If it wasn't for Bauhaus, the modern world that we know, live in, and experience today wouldn't exist. For example, the likes of this would never have come to be. So yes, out of all of the design movements that have come and gone over the years, there was a time before Bauhaus and basically everything that came after it. Bauhaus is incredibly important to understand, not just from a stylistic point of view, but also as a point of time that shaped our entire industrial world of today. And as a designer who has spent more than enough time studying the subject, I might be able to enlighten you with some substance behind the word. Defining Bauhaus. No, it was not a design movement like Baroque or Neoclassicism, not originally. It was actually a simple school of art and design established in Germany by an architect, nothing more. But the approach of how the professionals educated their students was entirely different. There had never been a time when art and industry had been combined in a single place. Before the time, they were separate. If you wanted to become an artist, you would go to art school. If you wanted to learn a trade like woodwork, you would learn carpentry. But the concept of bringing these two facets together gave the school its backbone, and thus the field of industrial design was born. The whole idea of a hands-on approach, a method of critical thinking when it came to finding a correct balance between functionality and beautification. Think about it this way. How many of you had a workshop in school? Maybe you took woodwork as a class, or had technology lessons in the lab. Thank the Bauhaus school for that. Now, I'm not going to go further into the subject, because odds are I'll begin talking all about the designs of the time and the people who made them. Maybe that can be for another video. But I think it is important to understand the quintessence of the Bauhaus motif. You hear the words minimalist and simplistic used so often, but again, these words have no meaning unless you understand that before the Bauhaus method, the principle of design revolving around deduction was not a popular concept. Designs prior to the time focused on opulence and filigree, so it took a completely different mindset to suddenly say, no, we aim to reduce for the betterment of function. Bear in mind that this was happening during a time when the West was going through the Roaring Twenties and the Art Deco period. Just look at the products of that time. So the Bauhaus movement, like many grand things with humble beginnings, was small. It was not highly celebrated at the time, and really only after the end of the Second World War was its methods used again, most notably by the brawn product designer Dieter Rams, who has literally written the book on modern industrial design. Chalk up everything I've said in this brief history of Bauhaus, and now you might be able to see why it is such a fascinating movement. But today, products are just seen as simple and minimalist, with muted colors, and most just shrug off and say, well, yes, that's the norm. I have to reiterate that that might have never been the case if it wasn't for that tiny school in Weimar. On to Nomos, a modern brand that has taken the approach of Bauhaus design to heart, and brought out a range of pieces that would have been considered radical then, but very plain, even ordinary today. Now you might expect after all the exposition that I'm going to sing the praises of the watches just because I appreciate what Bauhaus stood for, but that is not necessarily true. You see, just because they pride themselves on watches that incorporate the methods that the Bauhaus established, does it therefore mean it is good, or holier than thou perfect? I've said this a few times, but no product is truly perfect. It does not mean, however, that a product cannot near perfection. But is it really a selling point for their watches? The next part is important to understand. It is because of Bauhaus that all of these pieces came into being. You might not believe it, but following the same foundations, all of these watches come from the same ethos and understanding. For example, they use shapes instead of numerals on their dials. They are reduced down to very simplistic forms for the betterment of legibility. They all incorporate finishes that are fairly unadorned. Some of their designs make them visually understated. Nowadays, most of these pieces are considered modern classics, and as a good design goes, they are polarizing for people. So I have to ask myself, why go back to the foundations of Bauhaus when it has in fact evolved so much since then? You could chalk up virtually every modern watch design to be based on the foundations of the Bauhaus approach, so priding yourself on the notion nowadays is quite ubiquitous. Nomos in the briefest sense means law, translated from Greek. Now I might assume that since the Bauhaus design approach is the law they follow, it's quite a nice hint. It's an interesting name. The bread and butter of the Nomos line is the Tangenta and the Orion. These watches all come in different sizes with different configurations and color options, but their designs for the most part remain the same and under the same banner. I think it is easy to understand their design language when they are lined up in the same place. The biggest core fundamental is that the watches consist of as little as possible, true to form with the Bauhaus aesthetic. Of all the pieces, I think the Orion is my favorite, just because it is so discreet in nature. But on the whole, what grabs me about the pieces is the way their lugs are designed and integrated. All of them tie into the build of the watch and are all unique. They are accentuated on the Orion, and they make up a large portion of the watch's presence on the wrist. They also give an added element of aggression to the watch's design. The sharp and vertical lugs on the Tangenta is typically German, but also true to design elements typical of Bauhaus products of the time. I would say that this piece is truest to form, which is why it is a multiple-time award winner. The integrated wire lugs of the Metro is another such example of an interesting design choice. Before even beginning the discussion around the pieces, you have to give them credit as being wholly unique, but still tie together the family of pieces. Of all the watches in the group, the Lambda is probably one of the most honest Bauhaus pieces. This is the kind of watch that would make Gropius smile. Turning to the dials, they are all reduced for the sake of legibility. Some are easier to read than others. I look at their world time and I see too much clutter at a glance. I look at the Tangenta and find it difficult to read. But as an amalgamation of Bauhaus principles, the Metro does something different, and because of it manages to be unique. We see a power reserve indicator that matches the running seconds on the subdial. The hands are thin and accurate renditions of needle hands, and the numerals consist of circles that vary in size. But this watch is not to everyone's tastes. So what can we take from these designs on the whole? They pride themselves on detail, a very important element. Their hands are heat blued, their dials are brushed and anodized, their layouts are clean and unadorned, even their crowns are cut and machined differently. This is all excellent. And then talking about their movements, that's a selling point on its own. In-house calibers that have managed to challenge the status quo. Being a fairly new company that has established itself amongst the top names of Glashütte is phenomenal. But is that enough? Why are these pieces shrugged off by so many? This is something I need to emphasize. The Bauhaus movement was groundbreaking. It was small at first, yes, but because of it we see what we do today. It was not about falling in line and following the next trend. And this is where I see the brand finding itself. They are so determined to remain clean, clear, perfect, in typical German fashion, that they struggle to stretch their wings and break away. They just look like ordinary dress watches. Plain and ordinary is not something I want to say about my watch. And some would even call them cheap if they didn't know any better. But in reality, Nomos watches are superb. They have to be one of the handful that offer extremely good value for money, and their pieces are timeless and will never go out of fashion. Here is my conundrum and a solution. You can either take the Bauhaus language and hit it hard, or you don't. Brands like Patek, AP, VC and the like already have the simple, unadorned dress watches covered. The way I see Nomos now, it feels like the brand is trying to conform too much in the competitive space. They are trying to approach their watches in the same vein as the higher tier brands do. There is nothing wrong with that, but here's the thing. Nomos is in a position unlike any other brand in the industry, and so I would want to see them dig deeper, be experimental, break away from the norm and make something fantastical. Have fun and don't always be so serious with the designs. Dig into core fundamentals of distill, blend color theory and forms into your pieces. The brand has serious potential, and one I hope they manage to exploit to the 10th degree, because that is what true Bauhaus design is about. Not so much about conformity, but breaking away from normality. I have an image of Nomos being a watch defined by Bauhaus design. And this, coming from a watch enthusiast and a designer, is a watch that can be a part of any collection, and worn as a statement, rather than an understatement. And if anyone at Nomos is watching this and would like a designer to come on board, I'd be honored to help.